I'm Avery Schmitz, intern at Lawfare, with an episode from the Lawfare archive for March 4th, 2023. This week, the Biden-Harris administration released its new national cybersecurity strategy, which proposes recommendations to address emerging challenges in cyberspace. Preparing to face these challenges, cybersecurity experts have reconfigured their strategic outlooks on the basis of wargaming. For today's archive episode, I chose an interview from December 7th, 2019, in which Susan Hennessey sat down with John Watts and J.D. Work to lift the curtain on these intricacies of strategic policymaking. In the episode, they discussed the value of creative problem-solving in cyber policy, future cybersecurity challenges, and more.
Jacob Schultz, and this is the Lawfare podcast, December 7th, 2019. Wargaming has long been a staple of military strategizing, but how do we plan for the future in cyberspace, a realm where governments do not hold monopoly on capabilities? A new report from the Atlantic Council argues that, quote, describing the evolution of cyber capabilities in strategic competition require envisioning multiple futures, and sets out to do exactly that. This week, Lawfare's Susan Hennessey sat down with John Watts, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, and J.D. Work, the Bren Chair for Cyber Conflict and Security at the Marine Corps University, who are authors of Alternate Cybersecurity Futures, along with Nina Kollars, Jensen, and Chris Whyte. They discussed the behind-the-scenes of strategic policy planning, the value of creativity, and what scenarios emerge when you ask cybersecurity experts to predict the future. It's the Lawfare podcast, episode 482, Cybersecurity Futures.
All right, good morning. We are all here in the Jungle Studio on a dreary December, freezing DC morning. I have John Watts and J.D. Work here with me to talk about their paper on cyber futures. So, John, I think a lot of people don't really understand the work of cyber policy. And one of the things that's really interesting about this paper is I think it gives a little bit of insight into the policy process. So kind of set the scene for us. What was the problem here, and how exactly does a paper like this come into being?
Great question. So there's a couple of elements to this. So the cyber policy realm generally, and JD can talk to this better than I can, it's an interesting field for a number of reasons. There's obviously the technical aspects as they reach across every facet of our lives. But what I find really fascinating about it is because it's so new, it's kind of developing and evolving and iterating on a daily basis or a weekly basis. We're seeing new international norms kind of being created in real time, which, I find really fascinating. But one of the issues is, a lot of it is still kind of theoretical. There's still a lot of ideas of, what happens in a general war when cyber tools get applied, and the best minds like, JD, based on their experience and what they've seen to date, can make some predictions on where it might go. But we really don't know until it's in the heat of battle. I mean, when you look at, say, submarines before World War I, there is ideas of how they might be applied, but it's not until you actually get into general conflict where you can really understand. And so the idea of this paper and the idea of alternate futures is because we don't necessarily know the linear path that we're going to go to, and the reality is there's no real linear path anyway in futures work. Because we don't know, we tend to get locked into thinking that things will continue along a certain path that we're already on, or that they'll evolve in the ways that we think they might. We don't sometimes consider wildcards and different trajectories. So the idea of futures work is to look at some of the alternate ways it might go, look at some of the factors that may not seem significant now, but could have a big impact under certain circumstances, and to explore different realms. So the idea of this paper at its heart is to really challenge people to think a little bit outside of the current lanes of where they think cyber policy is and where they think it's going, to kind of explore some of the plausible, the possible, even if not the probable ways in which cyber conflict might develop.
What's sort of the time frame that futures work operates on, right? Are you thinking 20 years from now? Are you thinking 50 years from now? Whenever you're sort of trying to wrap your mind around where things might be at some future fixed point, how far away?
So this is always a really fascinating question to me in the futures work, right? Because, almost every event you go to, they say, 15 or 20 years. And usually that's because it's beyond the current budgeting process and there's an idea of what we might build from a military point of view in that time frame, but it's not locked in, it's not classified. So it kind of feels like a safe zone. I've done war games, on, say, the future of irregular warfare. And we did these in 2011, I think. And we came up with all these ideas of how people might use remote sensors and PlayStation controllers to have homemade, hand-built kind of death robots. And we saw within 6 months that turning up in Libya, where guys were attaching rocket launchers to ATVs and using an Xbox controller to control it. We saw in the early days of Syria, the Kurds had these homemade tanks with remote weapon stations. So we always say, it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years out and it's kind of Jetson-y. But the reality is it often happens a lot quicker and a lot faster than we intend. That being said, we talk about the cutting edge military technology and the changes we have. We're still rolling around in Abrams tanks that came into service the year I was born. And I'm not that young anymore. And we're still going to drive them for another 5 or 10 years. They're going to be 50 years old by the time they leave service. Similarly, a lot of the airframes, there was a project that going on about vertical lift, for the Marines and the Army. They're talking about a new platform to replace the existing one, where the current platform will go out of service 100 years from when the last platform came into service. So for all this cutting edge new technology, we're talking about 2 airframes, 2 pieces of metal over 100 years. So you have to be really careful with this sort of stuff. On the one hand, you got to calibrate it to a point where you push the boundaries a little bit. People get outside their current biases. And if you say, this is what's going to happen next week or next year, the biases kick in and say, no, it'll just be like it is this week. But you have to be careful not going too far out and getting too Jetson-y, because then it gets too abstract. The conversation, loses some grounding. And the reality is that these things actually happen a lot quicker than you intend.
Okay, so JD, the job here is to loosely predict the future. How do you guys go about doing this?
So there's actually a very long tradition of futures analytic methodologies. There's a whole toolkit from which we can draw. In this case, we began with an ideation session. We brought in about 50 folks from across industry, from across government, from different strategic and policy roles, folks that had experience both with future operating concepts as well as some of the implementation aspects of these things. And we began to work through a series of trends and drivers. Things we expected in the technology landscape to change, and to the idea of timeline and horizon. Part of that, we're driven by this concept of Moore's Law, whether it is real, whether it continues, that's an entire debate into itself, but versus these very long lead budget cycles we were talking about. So we've got some concepts around how we change, how society changes, how some of the technology pieces fit together. And then we really brought in the larger questions of the intended objective. What type of future are we looking to scope? Because the idea here is not to pick a single best course of action or a single best outcome. We know that it's not possible. It's not linear. You're looking across that cone of probability to identify the things that will allow decision makers to future-proof their strategies. So across the most number of these futures, what are the best options that we can see? And then, of course, if we are looking for those best options, what are those pitfalls? What are those minefields? What are those things that would create a less than optimal outcome? And how do we foresee those?
So you get a group of smart, knowledgeable people in a room, and you get them to start discussing trends. Are you putting specific scenarios on the table? Are you getting them to sort of describe the current state of play, to make the predictions, right? How do you break out of the cycle of just a bunch of people sort of talking about their biases and about sort of the expertise based on what they already know, and really move them into a conversation that starts to be operating, John, on the timeline that you're talking about? So
there's a kind of terminology for what you're saying in the wargaming realm, which is bogsat, a bunch of guys standing around a table. And there's, a real danger of doing that. I mean, you can have good conversations when you have good people, but you certainly need more structure than that. So this wasn't a war game per se, but you still need structure in the way that you're discussing it. So, first of all, there's a lot of social engineering that goes into these sort of activities in terms of picking the right people, picking the different perspectives. I mean, if you bring in a bunch of people who are going to agree on the same topic or have the same biases, you're not going to get anything valuable out of it. The other aspect is, part of doing this sort of activities is about tapping into kind of the unknown knowns, those things that people kind of subconsciously understand or aware of or think about every day, but maybe don't articulate, right? And if I go to someone and say, tell me what the future of cyber is, I'll probably get a pretty vanilla, vague, boilerplate answer, right? But if I say, here's a situation where X happens and these are the considerations and these are the factors, what do you do next? Then it sharpens a focus and it taps down into that subconscious knowledge. When you do that with a bunch of smart, interesting people where that person's answer can trigger someone else's response, then you start getting interesting things happening. So the first part of it is getting the right group of people. And we put a lot of work into identifying diverse perspectives, people that aren't going to necessarily get along or share the same view of the world. We came up with a bunch of themes that we had running into the day that we thought was things that we wanted to focus on or thought were kind of the key issues as we see them today. And we kind of presented to everyone. We started the day with a number of briefs, people like August Cole, who's a good friend, Dr. Ben Jensen from Marine Corps University, came in and gave kind of state of play discussion. So everyone kind of had a base of knowledge or thought about some of the themes going on. And then we structured into several days. So the larger group got split into smaller groups that had facilitated conversations. And we asked a number of very specific questions. So in that, I think the first session we brainstormed, identify in isolation the current trends in the cyber policy realm. What are the things that you're seeing? Let's just brainstorm as many as we can. And then from that, we looked at, kind of the current forces that are driving those trends, what the divergent trends might be, and then kind of, the impact analysis of what does that mean? What are the implications of those trends going forward? And that was in the morning. After that, we had a facilitated conversation where we kind of bounced those ideas off, where someone might say, I think this is really important, and someone else can say, yeah, it's not really that important because of these reasons. And someone said, well, actually, that used to be the case, but now things are different. And that's that, that iteration that you have in the conversation, where when it's well facilitated, you have an ideation of ideas, you have critiquing those ideas, and then either validation or iteration and building upon them into the next thing. So we had a facilitated conversation, and in the afternoon we had a kind of a wild card thing where we built scenarios based on some of that morning conversation of what happens next, what are the wild ideas, and then the kind of the last phase of all this was after the day was done. We had this group of us, so JD, me, Nina, Ben Jensen, Brandon Veliano, a bunch of the facilitators and guys were involved in the activity, and we brainstormed what the key themes or ideas or things we heard, the divergent ideas we had were. And we brainstormed, I think, about 14 or 15 that we thought were really key issues that we had heard during the day that were worthwhile. And then from that, we kind of down selected and kind of collated some together and came up with composite themes or ideas that collected some together. And that's was really the basis for which we then asked JD and Nina and Chris to kind of go away and be creative and draw out those into sort of fully fleshed scenarios. So it's actually quite a long process and methodology that gets to, hey, let's write a scenario.
So you facilitate this interesting, methodologically structured conversation, and then people like you are essentially observing and learning from this and pulling out trends that are interesting to you in order to start doing the more kind of specific, futures and scenarios that we actually see come out in this paper. I think it's fascinating just sort of how much process goes into, this, relatively brief paper that comes out at the end. Sort of talking about the substance, these meetings are typically done under sort of Chatham House rules where you can't say who precisely said what or who was even there. But at a general level, what were the substantive trends? What were the sort of conversations that you heard people talking about and sort of the shared assumptions and the maybe surprising friction points that conversation started to spark? So you talked about these trends that you distilled down. What was the conversation like? Sure.
And the divergence was actually very much a surprise. If we accept the maximum that the future's already here, it's not evenly distributed. We run into folks that have encountered different pieces of those distributed futures, and everyone has a different perspective based on that collision. And from those collisions, you have a pretty interesting set of different lines of thought. So some of the areas where we had a lot of collisions, and therefore a lot of interesting discussion and things that informed our scenarios, were around this idea of persistent engagement. the new U.S. Cyber Command vision for how...
So unpack that a little bit, sort of what is meant by persistent engagement.
Sure. U.S. Cyber Command has articulated a new vision by which it will conduct operations, engage in partnerships, and contest and challenge adversary hostile action against our networks, our allies' networks, our critical infrastructure. If you look back on the past several years, we've had some, very seriously hard challenges caused by adversary presence, caused by disruptive and destructive acts, and caused by sustained industrial espionage, economic espionage. General Alexander has cited this as the largest transfer of wealth in human history. If you look at the traditional national security strategy space, we have struggled to articulate a means to compete in that area below the threshold of armed conflict. And there have been longstanding discussions about whether we can deter adversary action in the space, whether deterrence even works in cyberspace. And to the extent that we are looking to craft a new way forward, there are folks on different portions of an intellectual spectrum around these ideas. And particularly where folks have had different equities, if they're a private sector player, what it means to think about adversary presence on their networks versus what it means to have potential U.S. government or allied nation support or presence to contest on those networks. Some of the difficult challenges around the threat evolution and the pace of that evolution. And of course, what it means across this changing technology landscape, not just talking about servers and endpoints, but as we move into a much more cloud-oriented environment, a much more personally intimate device environment where we have personal area networks of wearable devices, implanted devices, incredibly interconnected technologies as the internet has begun to avert more aggressively.
If I can just jump on something for a minute, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I've heard a lot of discussion about since, and there's just a lot of discussion in DC on this, was this idea of cyber deterrence and whether you can or you can't. And I think one of the points that JD made in his scenario was this idea that there's an inherent contradiction in the deterrent aspects of cyber, which is to say that deterrence only works if you either utilize a tool, in which case it's then out in the wild and your adversaries can have it as well, and so then it kind of loses its deterrence ability, or if you keep it secret so people don't know you have it. But if it's secret and no one knows you have it, then it's not really going to deter anyone, right? So, JD, maybe if you can unpack that a little bit, because I think that's something that a lot of people are talking about. I think you tackled really well in this paper, and I think kind of needs greater discussion, I thought.
Sure. So the scenario that wound up in the final report was actually a combination of two different primary lines of thinking. So the first was this idea of as well conflict below the belt. So the classic Clausewitzian struggle between different contestants in the space of politics by other means. And then also the idea of no bots land, where we have iterated the speed of capabilities evolution, that is the ability to employ new offensive techniques and against new attack surfaces faster than we can account for within our human planning processes and within our traditional mechanisms we use to generate and control national power. It's simply a different type of warfighting in this environment. And how does warfighting change in this environment? Across that, we then ask the hard question of what does it mean to do persistent engagement against these types of concerns at the depth of time we've seen from the long war. So we have the Cold War, we have the global war on terrorism, now this multi-decade engagement across a large spectrum of the world. We are essentially looking at this open-ended engagement in the cyber domain across a number of near-peer and other adversaries, threat concerns. So where we are crafting a strategy for that depth of time, what does it mean for our capabilities? What does it mean to manage those capabilities? We have a pervasive vulnerability in the domain that is caused by the complexity, the interconnected nature of these systems, the rapid pace of change, and the rapid fragmentation of developmental control. It does not appear from our vantage point that will change anytime soon, because it requires some fundamental re-architecting of those network processes and the value creation mechanisms by which those processes are generated. So if we are going to continue to have this pervasive vulnerability, there will be offensive capabilities to exploit this. The management of those offensive capabilities as a fleet management problem, as an arsenal management problem, at the depth of time becomes a very difficult challenge. We've had, for the past decade, very intense debates around things like vulnerability equities process. That is, if the U.S. government is aware of a specific vulnerability that might have offensive utility, how quickly can we disclose that to the private sector to protect those industries versus what is husbanded as an offensive option against our adversaries? How do we balance those competing interests? And then, of course, when we come to not merely having an arsenal on the shelf, but we begin to use these capabilities to contest adversary presence on the network, to deny their ability to interfere with an election, to deny their ability to disrupt power or water in a targeted urban environment. We cannot permit that vulnerability to be exploited by those adversaries, but we have to be very careful about how we employ those offensive capabilities.
So let's use that as sort of a place to talk about the divergence between sort of conventional wisdom and sort of the current path and the path that futures planning might lead us down, right? So it's a complex area. That said, to the extent you were surprised by some of these trends, how would you characterize kind of the conventional wisdom, right? Here's on the general thinking over vulnerabilities, equities in the long term. Here's like the conventional wisdom that we're all just kind of moving towards. How would you characterize that? And how did ultimately the conversation and sort of the scenario that you developed, which I think reflects a certainly more sophistication and sort of hard questions on it, where do those points start to diverge?
So the conventional wisdom states the U.S. government and our Five Eyes partners and some of our other allies have the best offensive capabilities in the world. We have the best cyber forces, and that we will continue to do so. Obviously, we see a number of near peers chasing very hard to create parity. We see a number of emerging programs coming out, and we see a number of folks coming to the table from very non-traditional places that just had not been a factor previously. In the West, we understand that private sector cyber intelligence capabilities have given us, in the public discussion, the bulk of what we know about the domain, and it's changing how we understand the domain. Previously, these are things we could have kept secret for years or decades, are being known in near real time, often playing out live on Twitter. And that changes the nature of disclosure, it changes the nature of how we understand threats. And of course, there are new players coming into the market. So we looked at some of the emerging market cyber intelligence capabilities that might come to the table, how adversaries may use these, how other players may misinterpret things they see in partial form. That was a bit of a set of surprising findings. We call out one example in this scenario as a bit of a vignette where if one assumes that adversaries are seeking to exploit information regarding emerging infectious diseases, potentially for their own attack purposes, if one is watching the adversary attempting to achieve that objective and contest that adversary, what does it mean if someone, a third party, detects the activity to watch that and misinterprets that in the first place? So there's a lot of this wilderness of mirrors dynamic that came out. There are a few other things along this where we saw a set of surprising questions around what happens when the cabinet is empty. We believe we have these best-in-class capabilities. We only have so many of them. Our cost basis for acquiring them is much higher than many of our adversaries. Our lead times to acquire these capabilities are longer than we're comfortable with based on legacy acquisition processes, a few other areas of concern. And our talent pool is excellent, but it's restricted in different ways by the nature of the security clearance process, by the nature of our bureaucratic structure. So when we're playing at the depth of the arsenal, how quickly can we refresh a set of capabilities, particularly when we are facing the volume, velocity, and variety of threats that we see coming down the road? And what happens when we reach that moment where that cabinet is empty, we have a crisis, we have multiple concurrent crises, and we don't have an option to give to the decision maker?
So I think if I can draw upon kind of a wilder out there. So one of the things you asked about, what are the different ideas it generated? They're kind of all there. But we actually those that we didn't generate into full scenarios, we put at the back of the report as wildcards, and some of them are the ones that I actually find most fascinating and really want to kind of see expanded. And actually, you'll see for anyone who reads the paper, we state this is a process, it's an ongoing iterative process, and that we encourage people to engage intellectually with the material. If you don't like the scenario, challenge us. Send us your own version of it. And the wild cards we left in there, in part as kind of a challenge to people to say, write your own scenario. Take this and run, like develop this out. If you've got an idea around it, come back and tell us about it. And we're hoping to do this event, regularly and publish more versions of it. But I'll give you an example. I mean, we are often fairly good at predicting technology and its application, in the broadest sense. What we as humans generally are really bad at is understanding cultural and social change over time, right? And particularly values. Peter Singer often talks about there's a picture from the World Fair in the 50s or 60s where it had this picture of a woman in a living room ironing, and around her was all this technology with something that looked like a flat screen TV and something that looked like a microwave, and the technologies weren't that far off. The one thing it missed was the social change of a woman at home ironing shirts in the middle of the day and not in the workforce. Right, which is far more impactful and far more important, but we miss that. So the technology, we're like, oh, we can apply it this way. It's relatively, sterile. It's pretty straightforward. We really miss the messiness of social change. And so one of my favorite wildcards was around some of the trends that at the moment are kind of edge signals amongst the youth. And I'll give you an example. So, I think today's generation are pretty comfortable with teaching themselves skills. And while I'm not part of that generation, I see that bleeding into my life. I've taught myself most of my home mechanic skills by watching YouTube videos. And I can do virtually anything on my car by finding the right video, watching what it does, and just a basic level of knowledge. And I think, this generation and future generations will be really comfortable with these kind of homemade, do-it-yourself things where they kind of empower themselves to learn new skills by themselves. So what does that look like in the future, particularly those within, say, the hacker realm or those that are slightly outside the law that I'd heard there was a story down in Florida where the Florida state government was trying to expedite tax returns by prepaying something. And they were actually finding drug dealers were leaving the streets to go and do identity theft because it was safer. I mean, they don't sell drugs because they have a passionate belief that drugs are important. They do it because they make money. If they're going to make money in a safer way, they're going to move to that. And so people were actually making money teaching others how to do this identity theft in order to claim, pre-tax return receipts. It's the same thing. If someone finds a way of making money online through cybercrime, people will do that. And particularly in this sort of generation where it's really normal to teach yourself a new skill and such. But the other one that I find fascinating and kind of scary is the swatting phenomena, right? So for those who aren't familiar with it, the idea of swatting is it came out of online computer competition where of all ages, people of all ages will be playing competitively online, and they'll call up 911 and say there's a hostage situation at this person's house, so that the SWAT team go and knock down the door to disrupt the other person, right? And on one level, it's not really that dissimilar to the old pizza prank. You call someone's house and send them pizzas they don't want. It's effectively just an extension of that, but it's so much more deadly. But this idea of if you're a 12 or 13-year-old who's grown up in a culture and environment where that's an acceptable thing to use state violence to disrupt a competitor for what is a fairly petty, insignificant outcome that has resulted in deaths, by the way. There have been several people shot by police in these raids. If you're comfortable leveraging state capabilities, violent force to achieve a relatively minor end, what happens when they get to 20 or 30 and they either, whether they're in government, whether they are, they follow a life of crime, whether they just, really dislike their sports team from across the way and want to disrupt them in some ways? What happens when those cyber skills become democratized and dispersed in the general population, and people see this as a perfectly acceptable, normal approach? What does that mean? That's the social change. It doesn't have anything to do with the technology per se, but that's going to have a really big impact on the cyber environment and particularly in that kind of persistent conflict in the future.
So how do you marry that with the sort of practicality of actual scenario planning, right? So you want to have been the actor that foresaw a little bit of the future, that recognized the trend early, presumably so that you can change your behavior and do the thing that others wish that they had done earlier. You're describing a trend that is both terrifying and completely plausible. How does that translate into cyber futures?
So in doing the futures work, there's a couple of different methodologies you can use. The simplest one is to say, okay, what are the trends that are driving this? So what are the forces that are driving this trend, and where does this go in the future? So you extrapolate out into the near future. You say, well, at the moment, it's a pretty minor thing. It's only done between a small number of people. Maybe it just stays there. It's kind of an oddball niche issue that comes up once in a while, but really, kind of stays below, any significant, public awareness, and that's the trend that just stays like that. And it's unlikely to stay that way, but that's one possible future, right? The alternative is that there is some sort of divergent event where there's a crisis, maybe, a 6-year-old dies in a raid or a house burns down or something that catches the public attention, people get outraged at, and there's a massive shift by companies and such. And you can see that in, environmental issues and a whole range of other things. Even McDonald's changing their styrofoam containers to cardboard, for instance, right? There can be an issue that suddenly grabs attention and everyone gets behind, and there's a society-wide kind of force and pressure to change the conditions. So that's one path where maybe that goes away because society worries about it so much that it kind of gets crushed. There's the other where it becomes completely normalized. That might be the growth of esports. It might be, increasing joblessness that has to do with the economy. It's just completely unrelated, but you suddenly have a large group of people who are frustrated and angry. Maybe it connects with other forces such as some of the extremism that's coming out of Reddit and 4chan and those sort of places that we're seeing with, the what do they call them, the incel movements and those sorts of things. Maybe multiple trends collide. And so, what you do is you break it down into its component parts and see how those different components may continue on in its fashion, or how they may change over time under what conditions. And then from that, you kind of work back and you say, okay, well, I'm going to see what the worst case scenario is, which is usually in the futures work what you're trying to do, because you're trying to shock people into realizing how badly things can go. So you might say, this becomes widespread, hundreds of kids a year die from it. And then you work backwards to say, how did we get here? And that scenario then paints that picture of the chain of events, a sequence of events that gets you to that end state, and then talk about, what some of those wider implications may be.
So JD, one trend I was struck by in your specific scenario, which I think is maybe less arresting, but as plausible, is sort of this built-in assumption surrounding economic espionage, that we essentially fail to deter economic espionage, and that this becomes something in which the incentives just drive basically all actors to get into this game. And the idea that international norms against economic espionage, or this ability to be able to create very fine sort of fact distinctions about who's allowed to do what, essentially fails. Am I overreading that as sort of an assumption and a trend? And talk about how that sort of that strikes me as both plausible and incredibly radical in terms of the way we think about really serious long-term planning. How did you come to that in this scenario, and how does it play out?
Sure. And I don't think you're overstating that by any means. I think you've captured that precisely. And it is absolutely a radical proposition. It will fundamentally reshape the nature of how we consider alliances between great powers into the next century. The basis of this came from some very difficult economic realities in the competitive space, where we've previously been within the cyber field focused on China as an economic espionage actor, a few smaller rogue state players seeking military capabilities advantage, seeking to acquire intellectual property for duplication and use in their own markets, as well as export markets. We've seen disruption of the solar industry. We've seen disruption of the wind power industry. We've seen disruption of the nuclear industry. We've seen disruption of chip making and technology as a result of all of these things. We've had DOJ indictments. But they've been focused on what we can traditionally consider those adversary actors. We have a very difficult economic reality coming through the terrible 20s and into the 2030s, where a number of states with very strong welfare systems, very strong socialist models of governance, will not be able to afford. They're going to run out of other people's money. When that occurs, where do they look for that money? How do they create new value? And do they, in some ways, is that a parasitic process? Collide that with some of the protectionist impulses you see, where there is an increasing attempt to target U.S. Silicon Valley entities by other states because they see that is a source of value. They're doing that through a series of regulatory measures. They're doing that through a series of other objectives for differing moral purposes and differing governance purposes. But at the end of this, we can also see this economic driver. And from this, if we look at a future in which the European Union perhaps is not as cohesive as it is today, we have Brexit, and then we have a series of additional exits, all of which get increasingly harder over time. What does it mean for these those polities to have this hole in their revenue structure, have this competitive gap caused by some of their working models, caused by the differing nature of their society, but trying to make that up, trying to find a way to excel on that. And of course, if those states have offensive cyber programs, and if those states have had, as we had in the 18th century, 17th century, a differing model of interaction on the economic space, how does that play out in terms of the espionage problem? And that's sort of where we came to.
And how different of a conversation do you think you would have had or did have 5 years ago? Right. So one of the challenges here is you're trying to predict things that are sort of fundamentally unknowable. Sort of the red teaming of it is, okay, take yourself back in time and say, all right, if we'd had this conversation in the past, here's where our assumptions might have been. Here's what we would have gotten wrong.
Let me give you a little anecdote. I did a war game, a kind of form of a war game, a similar kind of ideation activity with DoD and DHS and others, probably about 2014, I think. And like we did this, the methodology was kind of like a morphological table where we took like threat actors and threat capabilities, and we kind of looked where they might intersect and try to like generate new ideas of what that might look like and how, let's say a cartel could use drones or whatever. And again, this is, 5 years ago. And a lot's changed in that amount of time, in every facet of life. And in any case, I remember like at the end of it, during the plenary discussion, and we said like, what are we missing? We always do that kind of wild card, like what's the catch-all? What have you heard that we, that doesn't fit into the structure of the discussion? And someone said the thing that I see as the biggest homeland security threat is lack of critical thinking on social media. And we all went, deep. What does that mean? Don't know. And we moved on, right? But we lacked. There was a signal there, and we missed it, and that happens in all these things. You can't catch everything, but there was a signal, and we recognized that it was important, but we didn't put the time and the effort into kind of like fleshing it out. We certainly didn't have the creativity to think about how that manifests. Well, fast forward a couple of years, and we know how that manifests now, right? So we had the answer. We just didn't realize that we had the answer. And that's why you have to do these things. You have to do them continually. You have to push the boundaries. You have to think about the wild ideas. You have to look at some of those little signals amongst the noise that may not be important or may not seem important or may seem important, but you don't really understand what it means. You need to collect all those up, and you have to keep churning through different versions of scenarios, because the more you think about it, the more you expand, the more you explore, the more potential there is that you get the answer beforehand or prepare for it or understand, when you get to that future version, what some of the implications might be.
And I'll amplify that. We actually, at the Atlantic Council Cybersecurity Initiative, convened about 7 years ago to do an earlier version of an alternative futures look. So looking from what we focused on at that point to the last effort and today, we looked at this concept of differential information flows, variable structures of flow. We looked at the idea of different loyalties. There, our focus was very much on what it meant for the classic Westphalian state monopoly of violence to be eroded in cyberspace, and the changing nature of sovereignty in this space, where previously, if you take Lawrence Lessig's dictum that code is law, the folks that are writing the code are in Silicon Valley. And traditionally, the folks that therefore write law are considered sovereigns. We have a new set of folks that were focused on bringing norms, shaping the realities we dealt with as part of the international system. Fast forward today, we're looking at folks that have very different loyalties across that system, where the state is actually no longer the core source of their loyalty and identity. And this is our colleague Nina did quite a bit of work on this in the scenario she brought in, where suddenly we take those varying loyalties, we take the varying impulses, and we take the curated information flow, where we're not necessarily critically evaluating social media, but we're socially evaluating the flow of news and events based on our peer groups, based on those around us. And we're creating these self-reinforcing cliques, these echo chambers that can be manipulated, but also are tied to these critical concepts of tribe. And what does that mean to play out? These are things we previously had not thought about in this radically emergent version of the future we happen to be living in. And then, of course, when you play this out to the point where the ecosystem of devices you're a part of is more important than your passport, that's a pretty radical future.
So, John, what was your big takeaway at the end of this? If there's sort of one thing you want people who read this paper to focus on or to be thinking about in terms of sort of a practical shift in thinking, what is it?
I think my broader view or desire is I want people to be thinking a little bit more widely about issues full stop, whether that be in cyber, whether it be in conflict, whether it be about privacy or autonomous cars. I mean, some of this work, JD talked about emergent aspects. For me, that's a really important word, right? We talk about strategy or planning where we want things to be. We do all this work to identify trends and kind of logically say, extrapolate out this is going to be this way because of this, this, and this. But it rarely plays out that way. There's always, unpredictable dynamics where multiple things collide in a certain way and create this whole new possibility or future that we wouldn't have thought about. So I really want people to do more of it. I want them to read this paper with an open mind, not to kind of think this is us saying this is exactly how the future will be, but to think about what we're talking about and to take the time not just to read it, but to actually think about it and reflect on it and think about and challenge their own views on it. I mean, if they're not being challenged by this, then we haven't done our job. And what I hope kind of going forward is that the people engage us with this, right? So as I said, we hope to do future versions of this, but I hope people write their own scenarios. They get inspired by this and some of the other great work that the Mill Writers Guild and other people are doing on futures. August Cole and such are writing on sci-fi. Go and write your own stuff. Go and build your own scenario. Try your hand at it. Send us your ideas. Talk to your friends about it. Have a group discussion. Do like a book club type thing on what the future might be. That's really what the purpose of this is. It isn't to say, here's a roadmap of the future that people can just follow along. The whole point is to say, stop looking at the roadmap, think more broadly, challenge all the underlying assumptions, and be prepared for whatever may come next. That's what makes us resilient, is that preparation for the unknown and the unforeseeable. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this. Come in with an open mind, challenge your own thinking, challenge our thinking, have more discourse about it.
We'll have to leave it at that. John Watts and JD Work, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Thanks this week to John Watts and JD Work for coming on the show. Please share the Lawfare podcast and give us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Go to thelawfarestore.com for brand new Lawfare pens, lanyards, t-shirts, and socks. This podcast is edited by Jen Patje-Howell, and your audio engineer this week was me, Jacob Schultz. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thank you for listening.